Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we got another news and rumor video to discuss. In today's video, we're looking at some signings from the past couple of days, plus 4 teams who I think are on the verge or on the cusp of starting a new rebuild, with all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to the video here at the Indian Hockey Channel. Before we get into this video, don't forget to like this video and subscribe down below. Thank you for all of your support. We're never able to help you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below and don't forget to comment in the comment section below so I'll discuss today's video. Now in today's video, we're going to start today's video off by discussing a signing again. Only one signing from our past couple of days, and it was an interesting one, and that is the Colorado Avalanche making another interesting UFA signing, as they have signed Matthew Phillips to a 1-year league minimum deal to sort of help round out that bottom six in Colorado. So that's a pretty good pickup there for the Avalanche. Phillips this past year signed a 1-year deal in Washington, starred there, was claimed off of waivers by the Penguins, placed back on waivers and reclaimed by the Capitals. So he moved up and down this past year with the Caps, the Penguins, the Caps NHL affiliates. He put up a goal and 5 points in 28 NHL games with the Capitals, put no points in 3 games with the Penguins, and also had 3 goals and 6 points in 9 AHL games with the Hershey Bears, which is the AHL affiliate of the Washington Capitals. So he was a decent player this year. Wasn't an overly great player, but I think with the Avalanche, especially with them having some problems to start season with Nichushkin being suspended and potentially Landeskog still being injured, having a guy like Phillips who can really work it well as like a 4th or 3rd line forward to start the season would be really good for the Colorado Avalanche. So in my opinion, it's a pretty good pickup there for the Avalanche to sign Phillips, but that's the only signing from our past couple of days. Matthew Phillips signs a new deal in Colorado, and he should be able to play there as a bottom six for this upcoming season, so pretty good stuff there. Next, going over to a quick retirement, not too surprising here, but Oscar Klefbom, who's been out of the NHL for the past couple of years, has officially announced his retirement. Not too surprised there. He's a really good player. Used to be a solid top for the defenseman for the Edmonton Oilers, but suffered an injury, basically ended his career, and now he's officially said that his career is done. So interesting stuff there. Not too surprised. I wasn't expecting Klefbom to make a comeback, but he is officially retired. So interesting retirement there, and hopefully Klefbom can do well with whatever he's doing next. But he did have a pretty decent career in Edmonton. He's a pretty good second pair defenseman who ends up calling it a career. So interesting stuff there, but Klefbom has indeed retired. And lastly, going over to a couple of trade rumors. Now in this video, I'm going to be looking at 4 teams who I think are on the cusp of potentially going into rebuilds. These are teams who I think have older type rosters or are in not too good positions of a roster, don't have too much picks, they don't have too much prospects, and look like they're heading towards down the road of a rebuild. Now we know that the Hawks are in the midst of a rebuild right now, the Ducks are in the midst of a rebuild, the Sharks are in the midst of a rebuild, the Canadians are just coming out of the rebuild. I guess you could say the Sens, Sabres, and Red Wings are now starting to come out of their rebuilds too, but they're more likely playoff or bust at this point instead of just coming out of their rebuilds. You got Columbus, who I don't think really went through a traditional rebuild, but they're starting to be on the upswing. You have Utah, who went through a long rebuild, but now look like they're going to try and make the playoffs. So there's a couple of teams out there who have gone through the rebuild time. The Sharks and Flyers are another 2 teams who look like they're rebuilding too. So there's a lot of teams out there right now who have either started rebuilding and are in the midst of a rebuild, or on the tail end of a rebuild, starting to get towards the playoffs again. So interesting stuff there. But there are 4 teams, in my opinion, I want to look at here who I think could definitely be on the road of a rebuild. So I want to start here with the Tampa Bay Lightning. I think they are on the road to a rebuild. If you look at their team, they have a couple of decent players in their late 20s, but they don't have a whole bunch of really bad stuff on the forward group. If you look at their forward group, they have a lot of players signed for the next couple of seasons. You have Nick Paul signed for the next 5 seasons at 3.15. You have Brayden Point signed for 6 seasons. You have Cirelli and Ginsel signed for 7, and you have Hagel signed for 8. So most of their core is locked up for the next couple of years. You have Kucherov signed for the next 3 seasons at $9.5 million. So interesting stuff there. But their depth is mostly in their 30s, and they're mostly on short-term deals. So you don't have a whole bunch of bottom six forwards who are on the younger side of things. If you look at their defense, you have Hedman, you have McDonough, who are both over 30 years old. And besides that, they only have guys like Moser and Chernak who are on relatively long-term deals. Moser 2 years, Chernak I think 7. So interesting stuff there, but the core of the Bolts defense is quite old actually. So interesting stuff there. I feel like Vasilevsky is now 30 years old, still got I think 4 more seasons left on his deal. You got Jonas Johansson as the backups, and they don't have too much draft capital, don't have too much prospects in their system, so it's not like they're going to be able to replace all these guys. So I think there's a very likely chance, probably not this year, maybe not even next year, but I think in 2 years time the Bolts might start going down the road of a rebuild. At that point, Kucherov's going to be in the final year of his deal. The Paul contract's going to be tradable. Gensel contract's going to be tradable. Both those guys are going to be in their early 30s at that point. You could probably keep Hagel and Point and Cirelli, who are decent players and who are still on the younger side of things, but I think there's a very likely chance that once Kucherov is entering the final year of his deal, if he's not going to extend in Tampa, I think there's a very likely chance that Tampa team does wind up going through, at the very least, a small retool, if not a rebuild, and I could see guys like, at that point, Gensel and Paul being very likely trade candidates. At that point, Hedman's got 3 years left on his deal. Maybe he gets moved too. We got McDonough, who's going to be having his contract expire, so definitely lots of interesting things. I don't think it's going to happen this year. I think this year they're still going to be in the hunt for a playoff spot. I don't think it's going to happen next year. I think they might be a little bit lower in the standings next year, but I think there's a very likely chance that in 2 to 3 years' time, when Kucherov's entering the final year of his deal, that Bolts team is very likely going to go through a teardown. And even I think guys like Gensel's on a longer-term deal, Paul who's on a longer-term deal, and maybe even Hedman who's on a longer-term deal could all be dealt at that point. So I'll have to wait and see on that, but I think the Bolts are a team who's going to have to go through a rebuild in the not-too-distant future. And number 3, I would have to say New York Islanders are a very likely team to wind up having to go through a rebuild. Now, they have a lot of interesting pieces. They have a couple of younger ones too, but they have a lot of older pieces. Anders Lee's over 30, so is Brock Nelson, Palmieri, Pageau, Cizikas, and they don't have a lot of young players coming up in the roster over the next little while. Their defense is a little bit younger, but still, it's not an overly fantastic decor. So, in my opinion, there's a very likely chance that we could see this Islanders team wind up moving some pieces. I think it's quite possible. We know that Lou Lamoriello likes to keep his team together, and while Lou Lamoriello is the GM, I might not see this happen. But as soon as the new GM takes over, whenever that is, whether it's 2 years from now, 3 years, 4 years, I think there's a very likely chance they're going to have to go through a rebuild. I mean, if you look at this team, Lee, Palmieri, Nelson, Pageau are all going to be off the books in the next 2 years. So there's a very likely chance that with those guys coming off the board, they could try and allocate that money somewhere else. On top of that, after 2 years, you're going to have Horvat and Barzal signed for the next 5 more seasons after that in 2 years' time. So I don't expect either of those guys to get moved, but I could see a guy like Duclair, who's going to have 2 years left at that point, get moved. I could see a guy like Cizikas, who could be entering the final year of his deal, at that point be moved. I think it's a little bit less likely Engvall gets moved with the long term of his contract. Same thing with Mayfield, who I think at that point will have 4 years left on his contract at $3.5 million. Could be still a solid trade chip. But some more interesting guys that I think could wind up being moved would be a guy like Alan Pelech at that point in 2 years' time. Would be 3 years left on his deal, a reasonable $5.75 million cap hit in his early 30s. Pulock would also be in his early 30s at 4 years at $6.15 million. They still have Dobson and Romanov, who I think could definitely lead this team. And do have a couple of really good young pieces, like, say, Holmstrom, Dobson, like I just said. They have a couple of young guys like William Dufour or Cole Eiserman coming up in the not-too-distant future. So they do have a couple decent players, but just they don't have a whole bunch of really good prospects. And I think that could lead them to wind up having to go on a rebuild at some point. So I think there's a very good chance that we could see guys like Pelech, Pulock, potentially even Mayfield, and Duclair be moved in the next couple of years, not even including guys like Cizikas, Lee, Palmieri, Nelson, Pageau. There's a lot of interesting pieces, and I think the Islanders are poised to go on a rebuild at some point in the not-too-distant future. So we'll have to wait and see on that. Going over to another Metro Division team that I think is going to be poised for a rebuild in the not-too-distant future, and that is the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, I feel like the Penguins, they don't have too many players on long-term deals. The only guys who are signed beyond 3 seasons from now would be Rakell, Rust, Letang, and Graves. So very likely chance that they could try and move off some pieces. Now, if you look at their team, Marcus Pettersson's entering the final year of his deal. Grizzlick's also only got a 1-year deal. There's a very likely chance those guys could get moved if they are not doing overly well this year. Erik Karlsson is going to be interesting to watch out for over the next year or two, with him having 3 years left on his deal. But I think there's a very likely chance that Erik Karlsson could wind up being moved by the Pittsburgh Penguins. If you look at their forward group, Malkin's only got 2 years left on his deal. I think after that he probably retires, so I don't expect him to be around for that much longer. I talked about in a recent video how Rust could potentially be a trade chip for the Penguins. I still think that's really likely. He's in his early 30s. Rakell's in his early 30s. Both guys have, I think, 4 years left on their deals right now, so those guys could wind up being moved. Bunting, who's a younger type forward, could definitely be another trade chip. Kevin Hayes, Blake Lizotte, Noah Chara. This team doesn't have a whole bunch of players on longer term deals, and the guys who do have on longer term deals, such as Rust and Rakell, are potential trade chips. So in my opinion, I think with the older core of this team, they're going to have to go through a rebuild. Now, they have been picking up some prospects over the past little while, such as getting guys like Tanner Howe earlier this draft, They also have guys like Braden Yeager and Owen Pickering and a couple other decent guys. So they don't have an overly huge hole in their prospect pool, but they do have a little bit of a weaker one, and I think that could lead them to potentially having to wind up going through a rebuild of at least a year or two. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens there, but I think there's a very likely chance that the Penguins do wind up moving on and wind up having to go through a rebuild. And even if Crosby does stay, which is sort of up in the air at this point, I think even if they were to keep Crosby, they're going to have to go through a rebuild of some sort. So interesting stuff there, but I think there's a very likely chance we could see Russ and Rakell moved in the not too distant future. Also Bunting, Hayes, Pettersson, maybe even Carlson. I'm not exactly sure if guys like Letang or Graves will be moved, with them still having pretty long-term deals. But interesting out there, all these guys could still move, and even their goaltenders. I mean, Jerry signed for the next couple of seasons at just over $5 million. Nedeljkovic just signed for $2.5 million for the next couple of seasons. So I think there's a very likely chance that we could see the Penguins go down the route of a rebuild. Like I said, they have an older core, and they don't have a whole bunch of young prospects. So I think this team will have to go through a 2 to 3 year transition period from this older core to a new younger core. So we'll have to wait and see, but I think there's a very likely chance we could see the Penguins blow it up, especially if Crosby does leave this offseason. And lastly, going over to the team who I think has already started a rebuild, but I think are going to be going through it a little bit more over the next year or two, and that's the Calgary Flames. The Flames, in my opinion, are definitely a team who's on the road to try and be a rebuilding team. They have Huberdeau, who's on a long-term deal, Kadri's on a long-term deal, Sharangovich was on a long-term deal. Besides that, they don't really have a whole bunch of really long-term deals. I mean, they could move Kuzmenko and Mantha this offseason. Backlund's only got 1 year left after this year. Coleman's only got 2 years left after this year. Very likely chance that we could see some of those guys get moved. Andersson's only got 1 year left after this year. Very likely chance he gets moved. You got Bean, Miramanov, who recently just signed, who are also trade chips. I think there's a very likely chance that they probably will keep Weegar, will keep Huberdeau, and Sharangovich. I think those three guys are probably going to stay for the Calgary Flames. Kadri, I think, is a very likely chance to potentially get moved, even though he's signed for a longer-term deal. They could also move a guy like Dan Vladar, who I think is entering the final year of his deal. So there's a lot of pieces here for the Flames. They do have a lot of really good young pieces coming up, like Pelech, Coronado, Honjic, Perrick, Poirier. They have a really good prospect pool here in Calgary, and I think they could expedite their process of the rebuild. But I do think, given the fact of how many pieces have already moved off over the past year and a half, and how many pieces they could still move off over the next little while, I think they're going to go through a full rebuild. And I think it could be a bottom 5 team this year, could try and get a high draft pick, and I think there's a very likely chance that they will take the next 2 to 3 years trying to do a sort of a rebuild, and then trying again push for a playoff spot. So it'll be interesting stuff there to see. But interesting note there that I think that the Flames do have probably the most likely option at this point in time to wind up going through a rebuild. So it'll be interesting to see. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on all this down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk about for today in this video, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you agree with me that these are the 4 most likely teams who in the next year or 2, maybe even 3 years, are going to go down the path of a rebuild? Flames, I think, have already started that, and with the players that they have on their rosters, there's a very likely chance they could try and continue to move players and get some more draft capital and prospects and things like that to make this team a little bit more younger. I think the Penguins are poised to be a team who rebuilds in the not too distant future, and whether that be moving on from guys like Crosby, Russ, Malkin, Rakell, Letang, not exactly sure who they'll move, but I think with the amount of not too many long-term contracts, I think there's a very likely chance the Penguins do start a rebuild in the not too distant future, especially if Crosby winds up moving. I think the Islanders, with their older core, are also going to need to go through a rebuild. They have next to no prospects. They have a couple of decent ones, but they don't have a whole bunch of prospects or a whole bunch of draft capital, so I think they are also in desperate need of needing to go through a rebuild. And then I also think that the Bolts, while they do have a lot of really good long-term deals, and they do still have a relatively young core, I do think they probably will need to go through a rebuild in the not too distant future. So that's my opinion on these teams and who I think is most likely going to have to go through a rebuild. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on all of this down in the comment section below, and do you agree with any of the 4 teams that I just mentioned as the next teams to go through rebuilds? And if not, what other teams do you think could potentially go through a rebuild in the not too distant future? Definitely love to hear your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. So I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video. If you like it, subscribe down below. Thank you for the support and able to love you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't leave a comment down in the comment section below so we can discuss today's video. Also a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So check that out. I'll link in the description below. And I can't see you guys all for next video. See you guys soon.